Hi, everybody. I'm so sorry about that delay there. We're having a few technical difficulties here, but I think we are ready to get started. Thank you for joining us. I just wanted to go through a couple of housekeeping items and introduce our presenters to you. To start, and I apologize for my dog in the background. I'm sure many of you know how that goes. So to start, you'll see in the Q&A section, I posted a few links that are just available resources for you in case you're interested, including being able to sign up for a newsletter to learn about any future webinars and any articles or other content that might be helpful for you during this unusual time. And there's also a link to a form in case you ever are wanting to request some help that maybe you can't find otherwise in our Squire resources under squirecares.com. We'll go ahead and get started. I know we got started a little bit late, so I apologize. This presentation will be split between Samantha Lowe, who is a senior in the advisory department of Squire and Company. She has her master's in accountancy from BYU. She spent her time at Squire serving as an outsourced controller for client industries and enjoys that not only improve their accounting processes, but they benefit all aspects of their operations. After Samantha, we are going to have Nick Dunn from the Utah Valley Chamber of Commerce. Nick Dunn is a public policy and strategic communications professional with experience in state and regional government. Before joining the chamber, Dunn advised the Salt Lake County Council, directed media relations for the Utah Department of Workforce Services, and served as speechwriter for Governor Gary R. Herbert. Dunn has a master's degree in public policy from the University of Utah and bachelor's degrees in journalism and political science from the University of Nevada, Reno. So let's go ahead and get started. And Samantha, you can go ahead and take it away.
Thanks, Sarah. Good morning, everyone. So today we're going to talk about creating a back to work plan as the state and the rest of the country starts to open up slowly. Things to consider for the back to work plan. There's a lot of information out there, a lot of guidelines, and so we just wanted to talk to you guys about what are good things for you to consider for your businesses as we look to opening back up, bringing employees back and reopening to resume operations. So I'm going to go over some guidelines that we've been studying closely as Squires prepared their back to work plan that was published by the state of Utah, and then just hit some highlights of Squire's back to work plan and considerations that we've looked at that may be helpful to you guys in your businesses. So the guidelines that I'm going to review are public, available for anyone to access. If you go to coronavirus.utah.gov, that's a great resource center for guidelines that the state has published, in addition to some other resources, both for businesses and individuals. Also has some great statistics on case counts and other resources. So if you haven't looked at that page, I highly recommend you guys go there. But specifically to access the guidelines that we're going to look at the coronavirus.utah.gov website, you'll see there's the Utah Leads Together 2.0. This was the publication that the government released on its plan for reopening the state and guidelines for both individuals and businesses. So you'll see there's the full document that you can read. That's quite a few pages long, but it's got some great information there. And then additionally, there's the phase guidelines, which is what we're specifically going to look at. And these phase guidelines both are for businesses and individuals, as well as some key industries. So I'm just going to hit a couple of the highlights here. There's some great information here specifically for those industries that are called out here, like restaurants, personal services, anything like that. So if your business falls under one of these industries, I recommend you looking at the specific guidelines here. I'm just going to hit the highlights to show what we've been looking at and what are best practices to consider. So on the first page is the overview of the general guidelines here. And really the thing I want to emphasize is that now that we've moved from a high risk to a moderate risk, there's not a lot of change in the guidelines, both for the general public and for businesses. And so really what Squire's been doing during this moderate phase and what we're looking to do in our back to work plan is not make a lot of changes immediately, but create that back to work plan to prepare for when we move into the low risk phase and then moving back to our new normal. And so I think that's something to keep in mind and clearly communicate to employees as we start to release these back to work plans is the timeline for reopening may be longer than expected. The changes aren't happening all at once, but really are going to happen over a long time period as we move between these phases. So you'll see here, it's virtually identical between high risk and moderate risk. And then even when we move into the yellow phase, the low risk, most of the standards such as distancing, using hygiene, face coverings, all of that is still in place. And so employees need to be ready to be prepared to follow these guidelines for a longer time span than they may have expected. It's not just going to be a couple of weeks of wearing masks, but it could potentially be months depending on the control of the virus and how the spread is, how quickly the spread is being controlled. So that's just something to keep in mind. Moving through this document, there's also guidelines for individuals, especially high risk individuals, and the general public. The piece that I want to cover just quickly is the recommendations for businesses and employees. So this is the general guidelines for all businesses. Further down the document, there's specific industries, but again, noticing there's not a lot of difference between the high risk and the moderate risk. And so what we want to create our back to work plan is to prepare for this yellow phase and then our new normal. So here when we're preparing for our low risk, some things to consider. The big key here is employers need to take reasonable precautions. And so the question that we're trying to answer with our back to work plan is, what are those reasonable precautions? What is really to be expected? And so moving down here, the state does provide some general guidelines of what those reasonable precautions can be. So on page 15 of the document are just some best practices. So some things to consider are whether you're doing daily screening of symptoms, whether you're having them fill out a questionnaire, whether you're doing on-site screening of symptoms is something to consider. We're still wanting to encourage remote work where possible. Not keeping the physical distancing, obviously having increased hygiene with face coverings, hand washing, sanitizing, also sanitizing our workspaces more often. So those are just things to consider that we'll want to keep in place, not only as we move from an orange phase to a yellow phase, but may even be necessary in our new normal green phase to keep mask coverings or keep the distancing guidelines may become a necessity, as we'll obviously get more information as we move into those phases, but that's just something we need to be prepared for, that our new normal may not be necessarily mean the normal prior to the virus. So just things to keep in mind there. So I encourage you guys to really read through this document. It's got a lot of great information, especially for those industries specifically outlined in the other pages of this document. So I just quickly want to hit some highlights of Squire's back to work plan and things we considered. This is just an outline of kind of how we're laying out our plan and what we considered. So we're starting off our plan with just an introduction, and really the purpose of this is to really change the mindset of employees, because we're imagining there's a group of employees that are thinking in a few weeks things will be back to normal, but then there may be some employees that are thinking, will it ever get back to normal? And so really we just want to be clear on, it's an ever-changing environment and now is the time to be adaptable, but it may be a longer process than people are expecting, and so they need to be prepared for that. And then we want to introduce the use of phases. Hopefully a lot of people are familiar with phases, given that's the approach that the state of Utah is opening their economy, and so we're following a similar phased approach. But what we did specifically to help our phases is we sent out a survey to our employees, just checking in on their experience working from home, whether they felt like they were being effective, what difficulties they were having. And using the responses from those surveys, we were able to assign employees to specific phases, so that as we started bringing employees back per phase, we had a better idea of how to prioritize who needs to come back sooner and who would prefer to stay back in later phases. So that was one thing that Esquire did that may be helpful, is just surveying your employees, especially if you have a larger number of employees that you're not able to touch base with every day, getting feedback on how their remote work time is going. And then really we've just outlined in each phase what the criteria for the phase is, what the expectations are from the employee, what our expectations are from our client, and then office space, physical workplace expectations, things that may change. So just some things to point out here. In our first phase 0 is where we're currently at as we're preparing to bring employees back. Phase 1 will be our first wave of employees when we move to a yellow or low risk phase. But just some things to note is all of our common areas will remain closed, no access to the kitchen, conference rooms. People will be encouraged to work in closed offices. Masks, face coverings will follow the executive order from the governor on that, as far as making them required or making them strongly recommended. We'll have employees self-screen before entering the building, so we'll be encouraging employees to take their temperature at home or offer temperature screening stations on site, and encouraging employees obviously to wash hands and sanitize their desk space as much as possible. We'll also be upping our cleaning schedules to clean desks more regularly. We'll clean them on a daily basis as employees come in and interact with their environment. So these are just things to consider. Also looking at in our office space, do we need to rearrange furniture? Do we need to remove furniture? If we're going to have a waiting room open at all to public, to customers, do we need to, how often do those need to be sanitized? The CDC has some great guidelines on how often to sanitize and sanitizing your workspace that you can look at there and consider in your business. So this is just our back to work plan, our criteria for our phases. And then we've also included what our action plan is for employees with suspected exposure, or if they've had a positive testing, so that all the employees are clear on what channels to follow, and have peace of mind that we're thinking about, you know, that is a possible risk and we have plans in place for how to manage that. We're also including information for high-risk individuals and best practices for individuals. This isn't necessarily required in a back-to-work plan, but really we recommend including that, because what's going to be key here is training our employees on those best practices. There's a lot of information out there and a lot of conflicting information, and so it's easy for people right now to feel overwhelmed in what they should do. And so just including those best practices for individuals is a great reminder for what we're expecting of our employees, both at work and at home, and trying to just look out for the better of our employees and our families to stay healthy. So that's kind of it that we have for our outline, things that we've considered. again, using the guidelines of the state was a great resource. We've also looked at other resources that Nick's going to talk about with what the Utah County Chamber. But that's Squire's plan. So if there are any, Sarah, do we have any questions that we need to answer?
So for whatever reason, I've lost my Q&A, but I know that Matt can see it, so.
There was only one question. I provided a link to the actual document that Sarah was going over, the phased guidelines for the general public and business. And then somebody's asking if we can provide a template for the action plan for employees with suspected exposure positive testing for COVID-19. I think we're still working through that part. I suppose we could publish that.
Yeah, I'm happy to send a template of at least key considerations to look at and kind of how we're looking to outline that action plan. We can send that out afterwards.
Okay. That's the only question so far.
Okay.
Okay, thanks, Matt and Samantha. We'll go ahead and swap over here to let's see here.
Nick?
Hang tight, guys. Okay, sorry about that, guys. So we'll go ahead and have Nick jump in here. So Nick, if you want to go ahead and take over.
Yeah, thanks, guys, and sorry for the technical delays. I think that was on my end, having issues logging in and everything, but appreciate Squire putting this on and having us co-present on this. Essentially, a lot of what we'll talk about for this portion is very similar to what you just heard. Our chamber came out with this Safe to Work paper a couple weeks ago, and just a few days after that is when the state came out with some of their enhanced guidelines as part of the shifting to orange phase for the state's response. And so before we kind of jump into the meat of the document, a couple kind of high points to re-emphasize. Something the governor said in the press conference when they initially unveiled the transition to the moderate risk phase is that this doesn't mean that we as individuals or businesses can start to relax what we're doing. If anything, this calls for more vigilance when it comes to social distancing and sanitizing and wearing masks and those kinds of things. And so we of course want to reemphasize that. A big part of what we've been trying to do at the Utah Valley Chamber is to advocate on behalf of businesses, and prior to the state's transitioning to this slightly lower risk category, you know, we were pushing for, at some point we know we're going to have to reopen the economy. And our hope is that we can do that sooner rather than later with some of these best practices in place. And so we'll continue to push for that, knowing that the state leaders will have to be responsive to the public health data. So really the level to which, or the speed with which our economy reopens fully depends on all of us and of course all the consumers out there. And so, Sarah, if we can scroll to the next page a little bit. That's kind of just the goals section that kind of gives the overall philosophical approach to this, that we want to push for reopening the economy, but only in a way that's safe and in line with public health data is very important. And so the other quick things that I want to mention, and then we can kind of scroll through some of these actual guidelines, is as you guys are looking at this for your own business, again, obviously knowing to be more vigilant than perhaps normal, but also thinking of ways to be accommodating to employees, especially those who are at risk, like was mentioned a few minutes ago, with remote working and providing accommodations for folks who are either in any of the high risk categories, which you know is the older demographic or any other medical conditions that can increase risk for something like that. So as a business community, we'll want to be sensitive to that and just be nimble and adaptable. And then the last thing as kind of an overall principle is that this document that we'll go through right here is similar to what the state guidelines are that were put out. Not necessarily every single thing on our list is going to apply perfectly to your industry or your business. Obviously, with things like a traditional office environment versus a place like a restaurant, there will be different practices in place to keep things safe for your employees and for your customers. And so think of this as, yes, there's a large laundry list of specific tactics that you can employ for your business, but think, okay, which of these really do apply to my business and which of these can we do? And then also, what are the general principles, again, as was discussed with the state guidelines, as far as minimizing social interaction between folks and keeping surfaces sanitized and those kinds of things. So it's all about taking these principles and adapting them to your business model in whatever way that works. Sarah, if you want to go to the next page and we'll walk through the general guidelines real quick. So these are, again, very similar to what's been put out by the state, but in a nutshell, think of it this way: if we have general businesses, and this is like offices, your traditional office environment, as well as any company that makes stuff. If you have a production or manufacturing facility, these kinds of things can apply as well. And so having on-site workers essentially check for symptoms before they enter the workplace each day, taking temperatures, even though we know that temperature is just one of the possible symptoms for this. Obviously, anyone with a fever should be able to be at home for a time, and ideally, what the state's pushing right now is even to have any folks who have any one of the symptoms to be able to go and get a test for COVID-19. And so this number one, it's not just the temperature, but think of other symptoms. For your business, are there other ways to check your employees, to check in with them and see how they're doing and see if anyone's experiencing symptoms, to be able to isolate and go through and get tested. Masks, we've already talked about as well, especially in an environment where you can't socially distance in the workplace. So if everybody's in individual offices, that's less of a concern, but if it's cubicles or people are kind of closer together and they have to be that way to perform the job, then wearing masks is important. Safety glasses is an interesting one, because some folks have said, well, why safety glasses? That's if you're not a medical worker where you're not going to be sprayed with anything, why would you need those? And to be honest, a part of it, obviously, just to give additional protection to your eyes, but also as a reminder to not touch your eyes and your face so much. And that's such a huge part of this. Is just we subconsciously do it. We scratch our eye or scratch our nose or something, but having that can be a helpful reminder for that. For the next couple, think of whenever your employees are taking breaks or lunches, or again with the group of people they work with, think of ways to break those up or stagger them. So not everybody goes to lunch at noon if you have a common area that's still open. And again, as we heard, for some businesses, you may want to even just totally close your common area for now. But if you have some kind of break room or common area, you can keep those open, but as long as groups are staggered to 10 or fewer. Now again, this came out before the state relaxed some of the restrictions, said, well, now I can have up to 20 people. It's still probably a good idea to try and minimize congregation of people as much as you can. And so with breaks and lunches, staggering them, and also work groups. If there's a way to have your workforce, we know some businesses in the area have had, a Monday, Wednesday working group and then a Tuesday, Thursday working group, and you don't have any cross-pollination between the two. So again, you're limiting kind of that interaction. Think of some ideas like that might work for your business model. And we had talked about before, employees stopping and sanitizing their workspaces, washing their hands. And again, proper hand washing is really important. Number 6, regularly disinfecting or sanitizing all handles or flat surfaces in common areas. And even if it's not a common area, but obviously bathroom doorknobs and bathrooms in general, you might want to have, some businesses are doing this where you have one full-time dedicated employee, and what they do all day is they just go around and re-sanitize everything, again, with more frequency than, of course, we used to before this pandemic started. And then the last one, number 7, is a little bit more robust, but consider ideally a professional industrial or commercial cleaning company that can provide this service, but fogging or electrostatic spray, something like that on a non-working day, because you can't do it when people are in there, but on a non-working day or a non-working time, especially in high traffic areas, if that's something that would help in your business venue to, again, disinfect and sanitize anything in that way. So those are kind of the main ones, that first section for general best practices. The second section, starting on page 4, it gets into a lot more specific detail for the food service industry, so restaurants and bars. And I won't walk through each one of those recommendations one by one, but just to give you a sense of this, it's a lot of the same kinds of principles. So again, when people come into a restaurant, how is the spacing of the restaurant arranged such that customers are not near each other and tables are not too close together? You know, if they're buffet lines, obviously would have to radically change with this. You know, people shouldn't be grabbing silverware from some common silverware receptacle because they have the risk of touching other forks and knives and things in there. So essentially, at every touch point, you want to think of how do we minimize when customers are touching something that another customer may possibly touch, even including menus being disposable paper menus instead of physical menus. And then, of course, all the same sanitizing procedures, many of which are already in place by restaurants under current regulation, but just to evaluate those and increase when necessary. So those, like I said, I won't walk through all of those because I think there are 20-something of these additional practices for restaurants and the food service industry. This entire document is available at the chamber.org, the Utah Valley Chamber website, and there's just the Safe to Work graphic there on the homepage you can click on. But again, thinking of all of these as which of these apply to my business and which of these general principles can actually work for my business model. And so that's kind of the summary of the Safe to Work document. Again, this is very much in line with what the state has put out with their recommendations. We consulted with the Utah County Health Department on a number of different drafts of this document before we publish it to make sure that we weren't off base with any of these. And these recommendations came from businesses. So a lot of the stuff is already happening in the private sector. And the last thing I'll mention, and then I'll stop talking too much and see if there's any questions, is that a big part of this is going to be how we in the business community communicate with customers as well as employees. And so when people start coming back to work, and for any of your businesses, if you have temporarily closed or if you've scaled back at least, think of, okay, one, what are the actual things that I need to do to keep my working environment safe and clean and minimize or totally prevent the spread of the virus at all? So what are the steps I can actually do from this document, from the state guidelines, and so on? Number 2 is going to be, in what way do I communicate with my employees so that they know that it's a safe work environment to return to, and have that back and forth dialogue so that I know anyone who is in an at-risk category, or even for folks who don't feel comfortable, consider maybe how do I accommodate those employees as well, because this is a stressful time for a lot of folks out there. And then number 3, and this is a huge piece that will be dependent for if our economy really gets moving again, is the consumer confidence piece. And that's something that we're going to be working on more from the Utah Valley Chamber. But how do you communicate to your customers that it is essentially safe to come and do business again, whether you're a retail store or an events venue or a restaurant? How do you communicate? How do you instill that trust in your consumers and your customers so that they know, okay, if I go to that business, they're doing the right things, and I can still go there and do business with them and we'll be protected. So those 3 pieces, the actual steps in this best practice document and the state guidelines, communication with employees and communication with customers, to show them what you're doing in terms of all these best practices. And those 3 things together, I really believe that we'll be able to get things moving, hopefully quickly, obviously depending on the public health data, but those are the 3 things to keep in mind with this. Again, the whole document's online, and we're happy to help in any other way we can moving forward. But that's kind of the overview. I'm happy to take any questions if any have popped up as I've been talking.
Nobody has any yet.
Great. Well, that's pretty much our Safe to Work paper. And like I said, even folks who have things that pop up as things move forward, feel free to reach out to us at the Chamber. My email is there on the screen, as well as you can contact us through the website. But again, just to reiterate, this will take more vigilance from the private sector, but maybe to add one final note is on kind of the philosophical side is that you guys, being in the business community, you may have seen some of the commentary on social media and in the traditional press of being critical of the private sector or critical of businesses in this time, or saying, we don't, we're trading lives for dollars and all that kind of thing. And one of the biggest things that we're trying to promote from the chamber perspective is that this crisis does not have to be about pitting public health against private industry. And in fact, those two things are partners in this, and there are so many businesses that are helping get us through this crisis. And so just another thing to think about as you interact with your employees and with your customers and with the broader public is that the private sector is an ally that is helping to pull Utah out of this crisis. And if we stick to some of these guidelines and good communication with our employees and customers, I think we'll be able to keep on doing that and make it more clear to the public that we will not get through this crisis without the private sector helping to pull us out and helping to get our economy going again. So that's all I have. If there are no questions, I'll toss it back to you guys.
Well, we are open for questions. I haven't had any yet.
Okay, well, let's go ahead and wrap up then. And if any of you do have any questions that pop up a little bit later today, like Nick said, his email is right here on the screen, nick@thechamber.org, and you're also welcome to reach out to any of us at Squire. Samantha in particular, her email is samanthal@squire.com. Whitney, maybe if you could put those emails into the Q&A for people, since I seem to have lost my ability, that would be greatly appreciated. Thanks again, everybody, for joining us, and we hope we see you at our next webinar.